All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ruben Daniels, Deputy FHIR Product Director with HL7 International. And perhaps it's worth noting for the purpose of this presentation, I'm a co-chair of the Terminology Services Management Group who look after the use of external terminology for HL7 International. This session is approaches to using external terminology in implementation guides, and your presenter is the mighty Elliot Silver, lead FHIR software engineer with ResMed Corp. Please hold your questions to the end, and Elliot will answer them then. Thank you, and over to you, Elliot.
Thank you. I've got this. Yeah. Well, this is going to be fun because we've got Ruben, we've got Graham, we've got Lloyd here. So I'm going to say something, and we'll all go, oh, that's interesting. And then Graham's going to go, well, actually.
I'll try not to.
And then we'll all learn something. Okay, so welcome to using external terminologies in FHIR implementation guides. I'm Elliot Silver. DevDays has asked me to include a picture up there, so in case you're wondering, that's what I look like. I'm lead FHIR software engineer with ResMed, a medical devices company. I'm also a co-chair for HL7 International's Devices Work Group and a member of the HL7 Canada Council, which is relevant to this discussion as much of the presentations based on the experience gained contributing to the HL7 Canada CA Baseline Implementation Guide. I've held workgroup leadership positions with HL7, IHE, and DICOM, and I've been involved with FHIR for over 10 years. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. Okay. So, FHIR implementation guides can use terminology in various ways, including binding data elements to, say, required value sets in a resource profile, pinning system elements to specific code system, canonical URLs, using coded values in examples, and more. The terminology can either be defined in your implementation guide as code systems or value sets, or defined external to it. This is kind of an intermediate level talk. You don't need to be an expert in terminology or implementation guides, but you should be comfortable with everything I've just said. Also, I'm approaching this as a user of the HL7 IG publisher. I imagine FHIR simplifiers users are also going to encounter these challenges, but I don't have that experience. Okay, so if you don't define your terminology in your implementation guide, where does it come from? The simplest source is using terminology defined directly in the FHIR base specification. No doubt you're already doing this, and you're probably not even thinking about it. You can use terminology published in an IG that your IG depends on. Another seamless source of external terminology are FHIR code systems or value sets present in one of the terminology servers registered at tx.phir.org. These servers, including tx.phir.org itself, and various national servers, are consulted automatically as part of the IG build process. Other sources are not as accessible. Perhaps the external terminology lives on a FHIR terminology server that isn't part of the ecosystem, or on a non-terminology FHIR server. Maybe the terminology is stored as FHIR resources, but the resources are files on a wiki or FTP site. Maybe they aren't even FHIR resources. Maybe their author publishes them as CSV files or in a database. Or worst of all, maybe the terminology lives on a book on someone's shelf. As you can see, there's a huge range of sources of terminology for your IG, which may be easier or harder to integrate. Okay, a little bit of history. The HL7 Canada CA Baseline FHIR Implementation Guide started development over 5 years ago and was inspired by the US core with the idea of tailoring it for the Canadian environment, using Canada-appropriate terminology rather than the American terminology. However, we ran into issues. Terminology we wanted to use wasn't available on a FHIR terminology server, not distributed in an IG package, and not downloadable at the canonical URL. On the plus side, though, at least some of it had recently become available as FHIR resources, although in one case it was part of a DSTU packageless IG. Canada is a jurisdiction with a relatively strong adoption of V3, and there were established ways of distributing the terminology in Canada. In many cases, the CA baseline team wanted to continue use of that terminology, and the early feedback was that the implementers were comfortable with the existing distribution mechanism, which was essentially file download. Any change to that mechanism would have to come from Canada Health Infoway, who hosted the V3 terminology. The CA baseline team is unfunded, sparsely staffed with volunteers, and they've got little leverage. So the ability to influence Infoway or any other organization, any other publisher, was limited. So it's in this environment that we first started trying to figure out how to best make use of third-party terminology. Since the terminology is inaccessible by standard FHIR tooling, our goals included providing enough information that a reader could know what the terminology we were using was, some sort of description, a title or comment. And we wanted to provide some indication of how or where they could obtain the terminology. Other ways of judging how accessible we'd made the terminology was whether the raw canonicals were used in value set bindings or the more informative resource names appeared. Did the canonical URLs and resource links in the IG go somewhere useful, or were they dead links that went nowhere? Were intentional value sets expanded or not? Could we see the display name, the definition, or properties of a code system concept in all of the usual places in an IG? And finally, could the terminology be used to validate profiles and examples in the IG? These were kind of informal rubrics that we came up with as we played with various examples and noticed content not working quite as we'd hoped. This is actually probably the first time we've put this together and actually articulated it. Okay, so the best solution to making the terminology available, of course, is to work with the third party to get them to publish their terminology in a more easily consumed format, such as their own IG that you can add a dependency to, or on an ecosystem terminology server. Not only will that make your job your job easier, but it will help others in the community. My theory is that many organizations don't realize what needs to be done to enable easier consumption of their terminology by FHIR IGs or FHIR applications. They don't know what challenges they're creating for the consumers. If you can connect with the right people at the terminology publisher and educate them on the need and the benefits, I think we could probably change that. Maybe all they need is to hear the ask, hear the challenges. Maybe they need a little assistance developing an IG or loading their content onto a terminology server. While working with the third party, not only do you win by making the terminology available, but you're bringing the publisher deeper into the FHIR community. But what happens when working with the third party isn't an option? The default approach in many cases is to just use the canonical URL for the external code system or value set. Canonical URLs don't have a lot of information in them, but additional information could be provided. For example, on bindings and profiles or on element descriptions. Evaluating the use of a simple canonical URL, I'd say on the pro side, well, it's simple. It's a straightforward approach. There's no concerns about licensing third-party IP. We don't bring in any external content, so there's not a risk of confusing our IG's content with the third-party content. And as long as there's an agreed canonical URL for the external content, the terminology used doesn't actually have to be represented as a FHIR value set or code system. although we assume that it's in a form that our implementers will be able to load into their system. On the other hand, the approach isn't particularly friendly to our readers. It's got low information content. If you do decide to supplement the information, your options are limited to things like comments in each binding description. It doesn't address the issues of being able to follow the link to a meaningful page. And finally, it doesn't get any of the terminology itself into the IG, and using it, for example, in a validator is a pain. Another option we tried was to just copy the external value set or code system and add it directly to our IG. So this assumes that the terminology is available as a FHIR resource, but not necessarily from a FHIR terminology server. The external resource keeps its original canonical URL, along with leaving most of the other elements, such as the publisher, unchanged. Two places we considered changing are to modify the description to add a notice that this is an informative copy, or what the official channels for obtaining the terminology are. And for code systems, you might choose to include the concepts or make it a metadata-only code system. The pros of this approach: the terminology will largely behave as if it's implementation guide-defined terminology, because it is. And although we can basically provide unlimited additional information in the terminology's resource description. On the con side, well, we're copying somebody else's IP. And there may be limitations on what we're permitted to do. Even if we could distribute it in our IG, we might not be allowed to modify it, such as changing the description. There's a risk of confusing our readers about what content is ours and what content is the third party's. The approach relies on copying the terminology into our IG. Others may solve the problem for their IGs the same way. And so now we have a risk of multiple, possibly divergent copies of the same terminology, which, especially if we're going to go and edit some of the elements, might not even match the publisher's version. And then, what happens if the publisher releases an update of the content, but the IG isn't yet updated? What should a client use? So on the surface, I think this is an appealing approach. It looks really easy, but the cons add up pretty quickly. Another approach we tried was to create so-called stub value sets, with the primary purpose of referencing the external terminology. To do this, we created a regular value set within your IG with the definition referencing the original resource. You can include whatever you need to in the descriptive text, and the publisher and copyright information reflect your organization, not the third party. Although the third-party canonical within your value set might not resolve, most of the users of your IG will encounter your stub with its descriptive content before going to the bad link. An approach, and one advantage of this approach is that through the definition, you can select a specific version of the terminology or exclude particular values if needed. You could even insulate the downstream consumers of your IG from changes to the third-party terminology canonicals. If that happens, you change the definition in your content, but the downstream clients that reference your value set won't need to change their reference. So the pros of this approach, in a certain sense, you and your readers are now dealing with terminology defined in your IG. You can add whatever descriptions, instructions, etc. you want in your resource descriptions or page narrative. Anything in your IG is clearly your content. The third-party content exists outside your IG. Issues around IP are simpler than copying the external terminology into your IG. Links to the IG's terminology will resolve to pages within your IG, although links to third-party content from your stubs won't. And as mentioned, the stub value sets are more resilient to upstream changes. On the con side, this mechanism lets you to refer to third-party content only through value sets. It's not possible to create a stub code system. There is a little bit of risk of duplication of content and deviation from the source of truth, but it's better controlled, and in some cases, that control may be a benefit. Another approach we looked at was to create a separate IG for the third-party terminology. It does a good job of separating your content from theirs, but it raises issues around you distributing another organization's IP. And if you're going to pursue this route, I would suggest to work with that third-party publisher. Finally, and unfortunately, we don't really have any good solutions for content that's not in a FHIR resource format other than extracting it into a FHIR resource, which is the topic of yours earlier this week. Again, this is an opportunity to work with the publisher to make the content available as FHIR resources. So, we did a quick review of CA baseline history. Where are we now? Since the last major publication of CA baseline, Canada Health Infoway has stood up a FHIR terminology server, which in itself is a great step forward. With a little education on the need and working cooperatively with Infoway and their vendor, and HL7, we were able to get their terminology server integrated into the FHIR terminology ecosystem. This is going to eliminate most of the needs for the terminology workarounds found in the current CA baseline release. I'm going to be recommending to the CA baseline team that we build on that success and work with Infoway to develop a plan to get other third-party publishers to load their content onto the Infoway terminology server. And after that, if there's any external content that remains, we'll address it through stub value sets. So, in summary, when encountering inaccessible third-party terminology, work with their publisher on FHIR-friendly distribution methods, such as using an ecosystem terminology server or implementation guides. If that doesn't work, look at stub value sets, which provide the best options for educating readers about the content, and then duplicating external content and simple third-party canonicals could be considered as last resorts. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but hopefully this gives you a place to start your journey. Since so much of this was based on my experiences working on the CA baseline, I wanted to thank the HL7 Canada community, and in particular, I wanted to thank Sheridan Cook, who leads our weekly calls and who provided feedback on this presentation. So, if you want to reach out to me with questions, I'm here for the next 2 hours. Or feel free to reach out to me after. Please remember to provide your feedback, and I'll turn it over to you. You have any questions? What's worked? What hasn't?
Thank you very much, Elliot. We have just under 2 minutes for burning questions. Thank you. I'll bring the mic.
Yeah, not really a question, but now with the call, I kind of have to share what we're doing in Germany. So I'm charged with operating a national terminology server, not the national terminology server. Very important distinction in our case, actually, because there is a legal requirement for our competent authority to host a terminology server. Note, not FHIR terminology servers either. We need a FHIR terminology service. So in the profile stuff that we have going on in the Medical Informatics Initiative, the guys who are actually responsible for profiling, not myself, had first decided to use basically approach 2, so copying stuff into the IG. And then now we've migrated actually to the canonicals only model, combined with a very parallel infrastructure that I've stood up for maintaining the terminology stuff that we have on the server. So basically what I'm doing is taking the implementation guides that the core dataset developers provide and then basically mirror that terminology resources into different packages, which are just essentially for our consumption in the terminology server infrastructure, and then add references to kind of approach for like different package for example, ICD-10-GM. So right now I haven't been hit with a cease and desist because like most authorities in Germany do understand our challenges, and we are also working with those who are actually responsible with providing resources, but I hope that actually stays the case, that they are not writing me a sternly worded letter at some point in time. So
your experience sounds a lot like ours has been.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you all, and we are at time, so thank you again to our speaker, Elliot, and thanks to all of you for attending. Please fill out the feedback form.
Thank you.